On Florida's Space Coast, we think you can have the best of both worlds. Kind of like right now. Driving, at your desk, maybe at the gym, but you're also grooving to some music. Visit us and you'll go to the beach and see a rocket launch. Or go kayaking and manatee spotting. It's all waiting for you on the only beach that doubles as a launch pad. Plan your adventure today at visitspacecoast.com.
Game over, man. Game over.
You're gonna need a bigger boat. So serious.
I am Iron Man.
This is a tasty burger.
Welcome to the InSession Film Podcast.
Welcome to our latest Patreon bonus content for December 1st, 2022. I am JD Duran and always here with the lovely Brennan Cassidy. Brennan, how you doing, my friend?
It's about time we're finally getting to award season, talking about these movies we've been promising to talk about.
Yeah.
Although, we're recording this on December 1st, which, JD, I feel like this is sort of like the unofficial next step in D23 of sorts, because we had a new Indiana Jones trailer, Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3. All the marketing just kind of came out of nowhere on a random Thursday night. Well, not really random. It's the first day of December here. But still, it's like, you'd think we want to talk about some nerd stuff. And we're talking about more serious films here.
Well, I was going to start this conversation off by saying, actually, we are not going to be talking about movies, but instead we're going to spend 2 hours on Transformers Rise of the Beast. So
only
prepare
JD
yourselves.
here would be able to cry at Beast Wars.
So, real quickly on that note, because yes, Beast Wars was my jam as a kid. And Sam, my son, is at the age that I was when that show came out.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a little serendipitous in that regard. And so I watched the trailer. It was very nostalgic for me. I joked with Brendan and everybody in our little text group that as these various characters, such as not just Primal, but Cheetor and Rhinox and RC, like all of these other
you weren't
characters.
Kidding. You know these names like the back of your hand.
As soon as I saw them, I was like, I know every single one of these characters from that show. I feel like the only one I didn't see was Rat Trap. I'm waiting for Rat Trap to show up. But aside from that, like I knew all of the Transformers by name, by heart, as they popped up in the trailer. So I was a little giddy. And I really liked Bumblebee. I thought that was a really fun movie. That's arguably the best of all the Transformers movies. So I like that they're tailoring.
Some might argue it's the only good one.
Look, I like the Transformers movies, but I don't know if I would disagree with that notion. So there's certainly some merit to that. But I like how they're they're bouncing off that, and this is a direct sequel to all of that. And then my son gets home from school, and I show him the trailer, and his excitement is so palpable that I couldn't help but get a little emotional watching him react to something.
That's pretty sweet.
Yeah, it was really cool. So anyway, that is our Transformers talk for the day. Come back next week. Actually, as Brendan alluded to, this bonus content episode is going to be a lot of fun. First of all, before we get to that, though, thank you to all of our lovely patrons. Your support goes a long way. We cannot do this without your support, and we hope everyone is having a great holiday season with Thanksgiving now in the rearview mirror, and we're all heading towards Christmas. Your support really, really does mean the world to us. However, we are going to release this to the public on our main podcast feed after our patrons have early access to it. If you're listening to this after it is released to the public, thank you for tuning in as well. And if you want to support us on Patreon, if you want early access to all of our bonus content episodes, you can find that at patreon.com/InSessionFilm. But we do thank everyone for tuning in here. However, you are getting to us And we have talked about this on the show over the last few weeks. There are some movies that we've been catching up with that we wanted to talk about, that we wanted to give our thoughts on. Specifically, I finally got a chance to see the Todd Field movie Tar that everyone is going tar crazy over. And
what in the Tar Nation? Been shopping too much at Target these days?
Exactly. And unfortunately, I was not able to be on that episode when you guys talked about it on the main show. The lovely Ryan McQuaid filled in for me, I believe. And I was able to see it. I want to give some thoughts on it. We'll also talk about the war film on Netflix, All Quiet on the Western Front. We both got a chance to see that. Brennan and I have both seen Park Chan-wook's Decision to Leave. I will give some brief thoughts on Triangle of Sadness. I got to catch up with RRR. There was a Weird Al movie that popped up a few months ago or a few weeks ago that we've seen that we want to talk about. And depending on time, depending on how things go, there are a few others that I'll try to get to, such as She Said, until I've seen both of those.
Yeah.
And we'll offer up some brief thoughts at the very end of all of this. So it is award season. We are catching up on a lot of movies.
Yeah. Yeah, very high-level reviews here, kind of gauntlet style, if you will, just going through all of these. Nothing official, but we hope to bring some quick insight to these, because a lot of these are worth talking about. There's going to be some pretty heavy hitters here.
Absolutely. And speaking of heavy hitters, let's go ahead and get it out of the way. Let's talk about Todd Fields' new film, Tar. As I noted, Brennan got a chance to talk about this on episode 504. I guess before I get into it, reiterate briefly where you stand on Tar.
It's certainly one of the better films of the year. I'm not sure how much I like it just yet. I've still been wrestling with a lot of things, and maybe this conversation, like the conversation I had with Ryan on episode 504, will help me come to terms with certain things, because tonally speaking, there's nothing like this movie as far as comparing it to other movies this year. But it's a very effective film and a very timely film in very challenging ways. People might be put off by this one, and I kind of respect that it has that ability to do so. I'm really interested what you have to say about it, JD, because I've seen your Letterboxd review and I've seen your star rating, so I have a hunch, and I think it's pretty extreme.
Yeah, I'm really high on this film. I think it is one of the best films of the year, and it's not even close as far as I'm concerned. This is currently sitting in my top 3. I love this film. Cate Blanchett is as advertised. I'll talk more about her here in a little bit. But Todd Fields' writing and directing, I think, is astounding in this film. It is so incredible.
Sure.
And what I love about his storytelling here, for one, it's methodical, but it also jumps around in time with gaps in between sequences that forces you to infer certain things about characters and who they are, the choices they make, and what's driving those actions. And I love the ambiguity that's interwoven with that structure. One of the most prominent examples is with how the film builds up this idea that people are out to get Lydia Tarr and ruin her reputation. But over the course of the film, when you see the kinds of choices she makes, such as the way she treats her assistant and not giving her the promotion when she's up for it, or the way she brazenly panders almost flirtatiously to this young celloist in front of her wife even, and in front of everybody in the orchestra, or the way she replaces the assistant conductor. So much of what she does in this film is a bit abrasive and boorish, and it makes you wonder if she is guilty as it relates to, and maybe this is a slight spoiler, even though the film never really gives us a clear answer to it. But it does make you wonder if she is guilty as it relates to her possible involvement with this young woman who sadly committed suicide, and it arguably had something to do with her relationship with Lydia Tarr. Perhaps there is truth and validity to that.
Yeah.
Or there's the moment Lydia finds herself being canceled on the internet over a viral video that shows her being inappropriate in a classroom. And based off of her behavior, context aside, simply based off of her behavior, you'd almost believe that what you're seeing in that video is real or could be real. However, and this is what's so brilliant from a filmmaking perspective, the video in question is from a scene earlier in the film where she's teaching at a class at Juilliard, and Field shoots the scene in one take. There is no ambiguity to it. We experience, we see how it plays out in its entirety with no cuts whatsoever, which in the moment could seem like an ostentatious thing to do, but it's actually an intuitive sleight of hand because we know the viral video is edited as a result.
Yeah, there's a lot of irony there to it.
Exactly. She may have been challenging her students, and we can debate the morality of that, but she is innocent of the thing she's being accused of in the viral video. There is
in that specific moment,
in that moment, there is an objective truth to it, that someone on the internet is trying to undermine her credibility, and that what she's being accused of, at least in that sense, is false. So, as it relates to the young woman who committed suicide, is Lydia guilty or innocent? What is her role in all of that with that young girl? We really have no idea. I think it swings both ways. And I love that about Fields' storytelling and how he invokes ambiguity with the choices that Lydia makes throughout the film. I find all of that so fascinating. And you're right, Brennan. Because of that, especially coupled with Blanchett's performance, there is so much to Lydia Tarr here where you're compelled by the charisma that she certainly has at times, the intelligence that she embodies, but there is a boorish quality to her. She's rough around the edges in many ways. And when that rubs up against those ironies that Todd Field so diligently lays out in the film, it makes you wonder what's really at the core of Lydia Tarr. Is she just being manipulated by other people, by the internet? I don't know. You really don't know. And I love that about this movie.
Is she a victim or a perpetrator or both? Or neither.
Yeah.
And I think the choice of Todd Field to make Lydia Tarr not just a woman, but also a lesbian woman, I think sort of adds further ambiguity into that too. Just knowing who in the past history has been more victimized over others. We certainly don't want to get into those details because we just don't, we might not know enough about it to, historically infer those things. But when you read the tweets online, for instance, you can kind of get a sense of where the problems tend to stem from. And Todd Field makes choices narratively that brings about the necessity of those challenges, but also the dangers of it. The dangers of such movements, of such accusations, of such actions, and then of certain defenses that can also be kind of dangerous, but also helpful in the right way. I think Kate Blanchett was even saying in a couple interviews that this movie is not condemning at all things like the Me Too movement, for instance, but showing that there are still gaps that need to be fixed in order to, educate people in the right way about what good it can still provide, and that there are two sides to that coin still, which is so interesting. I love talking about this film in that way. And what I'm also fascinated about regarding the film as a movie, and you tweeted, I don't know if you tweeted this, you either tweeted it or texted us offline, JD, that this might be the most biting comedy of the year.
Yeah,
and
it's very fun.
That's something I'm still wrestling with, because when I came out of the theater, I was not sure how I felt about the film's humor. And then the more I thought about it, this secretly is kind of a comedy, isn't it? It's sort of similar to how we, how a movie like Paul Thomas Anderson's There Will Be Blood also invoked laughter out of us.
Yeah.
It's doing it in a pretty similar way, but I feel like Tar might be a bit more direct in that comedy. And
Yeah.
it's something I am coming to appreciate more as time goes on regarding that tonal choice from Todd Field.
Yeah, I thought a lot about Inside Llewyn Davis when watching this movie.
Okay.
In the sense that Llewyn also has qualities to him that make him maybe a little unappealing. He's not necessarily the most likable character in that film, but there is also something to him, specifically the grief that he's experiencing, that does draw you to him, and music. Ironically, both of these movies are about music. And I see a lot of the same things here with Lydia, in the sense that, yeah, she's not always likable, but there is something about her. There's this magical bubble that makes her endlessly captivating all at the same time. In both films, while they have a dense sense of drama to them, they are also playful at times. And they're also full of great ambiguity, and all of that is interwoven impeccably. So I do think it's a great companion piece in that regard. And maybe why I found the humor here funny. It's not quite Coen Brothers-esque. It is done differently.
Right.
But
yeah.
I do really like the humor, and maybe it was the surprise factor. I was so surprised by how funny this film is. I mean, that scene,
that moment with the accordion.
yeah, that I was just going to bring that up. The scene in the apartment, and she plays the accordion right after her neighbors asked her to keep the noise down was so good. So good. And of course, the final scene of the film is really hilarious as well.
Yeah, that's one of the things I'm still, I don't want to say wrestling with. I've come to like it, but that ending is so cynical and so bitter that
it is.
I still can't tell if it's jarring in the right or wrong ways, and maybe the fact that it might be a little jarring in the wrong ways is perhaps the point, because it's sort of calling attention to maybe the ridiculousness of what we're experiencing. So maybe that is deliberate. It's a movie I love talking about because of these choices that are anything but safe. I love that about it.
Well, and I think the cynicism there, I do think maybe there's a duality to it as well, because I don't think the film is criticizing or making a commentary against something like Me Too. But there is something to be said, and this is why I love the double-edged sword of Fields' writing and directing. The fact that he goes out of his way to shoot that scene in the classroom with one take, and it's an elongated moment, right? It's like a 10-minute sequence, completely unbroken. We see the entire thing in context. So when it comes up later on in the film, we immediately, without hesitation, know that that's edited.
Yeah.
We know unequivocally that she is innocent of what she's being accused of. But on the same token, because of her behavior throughout the film and how she treats other people, it's not that she deserves that, but as it relates to other things happening around her, such as the ambiguity of the young woman who sadly killed herself. Is Lydia Tarr guilty of that?
Yeah.
Maybe. It would not surprise me at all if she is guilty. And so there is this yin and yang as it relates to the consequences of our actions and how that is amplified even further in the digital age, and how quickly things can be taken from us as a result of that. I think what's so funny, maybe not funny, but what's so interesting about that final sequence and where she sees herself in the end, is it a result of her actions? Was that something that was always coming to her because she didn't treat everyone around her with perhaps the kind of grace she needed to? Maybe.
Right. Yeah.
On the same token, there's an argument to be made that it was unfairly taken away from her because of the viral video. There's nuance. There's nuance. And I think that's what he's arguing more than anything else. There's nuance to it all.
Everyone who sees this movie is going to have their own perspective they project onto it. Some people may even say that the harshness of where Lydia Tarr ends up in the end, they might say that wasn't harsh enough. She deserved worse.
Maybe,
and in a way, I would say to those people, okay, I can't say you're wrong. Maybe I don't agree, but in a way, I feel like what this movie is getting at is sort of the mission statement of what we like to offer as film critics, JD, is perspective. We like to offer perspective. We want people to listen to different points of view and have a dialogue about it rather than say, oh, we're recommending this movie because we say it's good. You have to see it. That's not what we're saying with a lot of these reviews. We're saying our own takes on these things because of how it makes us feel, and that invites dialogue. It invites perspective. So I think in a way, it's kind of like this reaction where you hear someone say a certain viewpoint, and it's like, oh, that's a pretty good point. Didn't think of it that way. Not sure if I agree, but I didn't think of it that way. This movie is the epitome of I didn't think of it that way. and I love that idea.
And that's what I love so much about the writing from Todd Field. I do think his direction here is really great. Similarly to Noah Baumbach in Marriage Story, where his direction, I think, is equally as pivotal to that film being effective as is his writing.
Yeah.
But Noah Baumbach is known as a writer, so that's what most people want to talk about. And I feel like maybe the same thing is happening here with Todd Field, although I'm not an Oscars expert, so maybe take that with a grain of salt.
Yeah, Ryan and I did talk about this a little bit on episode 504, where I think one of us, I forget who, may have been me, I said that I feel like Todd Field's script is really the star of this movie.
Yeah, and I do want to get to that here in a second. I say all of that to say his direction here is probably going to be underrated. I think it is very well polished and equally a significant part as to why this film is as biting as it is. But in addition to Blanchett's performance, yes, his screenplay is absolutely fantastic. And I mentioned earlier the gaps in time within the screenplay.
Mm-hmm.
I do love that for the reasons I noted earlier, but I do want to emphasize that the screenplay is still very seamless with how it progresses. It's very easy to keep up with what's happening with Lydia. It's never disjointed or uneven, but there's just enough ambiguity that we as the audience have to fill in the gaps ourselves and do a little bit of work, which I very much appreciate. And then there's the humor that we talked about that I really love. And maybe my favorite thing about the screenplay, maybe not my favorite, but one of the more striking things about the screenplay is that the concert that Lydia is preparing for, I love that it's nothing more than a MacGuffin.
Oh, yeah.
So much of what takes place here from a plotting standpoint.
The way that crystallizes, it turns into a giant red herring of sorts. It almost meant nothing.
It does. It means nothing, at least from a plotting perspective, right? From a plotting standpoint, she is preparing for this concert in Berlin and doing this really complex number that she hopes will put her on the map even further within that conductor field. And at the end of the film, that is nothing more than this humorous MacGuffin, this red herring of sorts.
And I do think Todd Field is playing with genre tropes a little bit there, because any other movie like this would end with a climactic concert piece of sorts. Like that would be the third act epiphany. That would be the conclusion of a story like this.
Like
so
a whiplash,
I feel like
if you will.
Yeah. And I feel like Todd Field sort of knows that's where our brain is going to go. So he toys with that a little bit. It's kind of a bait and switch. And normally I don't love that tactic in movies, at least when it involves like character bait and switches. That can sometimes feel a little cheap, but here I think it works really well.
I think it works really well too, primarily because at the core of this movie, it's a build you up to tear you down kind of story. And the nuances, the texture inside all of that, I think is done with great diligence and brilliance even. And it's the little things that make it so propulsive and textured.
Mm-hmm.
Fields gives us all the information we need, but maybe not always in the correct order. Or again, we have to infer things about that information. For example, and this is maybe a little bit of a spoiler, but I don't know how important it is to the plotting of the film.
Mm-hmm.
But at the end of the film, we learned that her name isn't even Lydia. it's Linda and she's from New Jersey or something like that, and seemingly disconnected from her family back in the United States. I love those kinds of details.
Sure.
Because it says a lot about her without having to examine the specificities of it. But it makes us question her choices even more. Like, she just made up this entire persona.
Mm-hmm.
Everything that we had learned about her fundamentally was a bit of a facade. So everything that's already blurry and hazy becomes more murkier with those little details.
Mm-hmm.
I just love that. Or there's the moment near the end of the film where she walks into the boardroom, and while we don't see how the interrogation goes, Fields then cuts to the concert that, again, is essentially MacGuffin here. I won't give spoilers as to how that plays out. I'll just say that what takes place there reverberates the idea that she's an unreliable narrator.
Yeah.
Because everything we see is from her perspective. And I love that. I just love the storytelling here. The screenplay is without question one of the best of the year. And then, we've talked about this film for 10, 15 minutes, and we haven't even talked about Blanchett's performance all that much, but
oh yeah, she's pretty good at her job.
So good. It is so good. So the question people keep talking about, or one of the notions that people present here, is this being the best performance of her career. Do you think this is the best performance of her career?
We talked about that in episode 504. I don't know if I'm ready to say that about her, because she's given us so many great performances that are also very different from one another. I tend to respond a little bit more to the sadness and the more humane side of Cate Blanchett's performances, which is why I think I might still give the edge to something like Carol, for instance. But I think this is perhaps her most technical work, her most methodical performance, if that makes sense, which in a way, it might be her most difficult then. And maybe for those reasons, I'd say it's at least one of her best, because it's a challenging performance. This is a hard performance to get right, because it's also a film that isn't reliant on showy direction to help emphasize a performance. The cinematography here is mostly pretty static. The editing is very slow moving. So Cate Blanchett has to do most of the hard work here, and that makes it even better. Yeah, I really love this performance in the same ways I think I do someone like Amy Adams in Arrival. Maybe not quite to that extent, but very close, because she is having to do two things here. She is having to give credence to Tar as this masterful conductor that knows music inside and out, which she does very, very well. And she does have to make Tar this engrossing, captivating character. I do think part of the sleight of hand here is that we do side with Tar to some extent. Sure. That we do believe her in some ways. While simultaneously, given the choices that she makes, and much of that is in Fields' writing, but Blanchett also has to give credence to that abrasive, boorish quality. And that's tricky. That's a tricky balancing act to make your character a little bit rough around the edges, perhaps a little unlikable, while still giving us that ravishing charm. That's tough, but I think she does it with absolute incredible precision. And that's why I think it's probably her most challenging role she has acted in yet. While I still love the sadness she brought to movies like not just Carol, but even Blue Jasmine. I think that's also one of her best performances, the Woody Allen film there. But I haven't seen Cate Blanchett really do something like this, and something that's this emotionally all-encompassing. Because it's totally speaking, it's almost covering every genre when you think about it. This performance is every movie genre when you really think about it.
It is,
and that makes it kind of great. There are times where this turns into a straight up horror movie, and she has to sell that too. There's one sequence involving this like dilapidated basement of sorts where it almost feels like a scene from a werewolf movie. I'll simply say that, and she has to sell it in a completely new way, and not
Yeah.
oversell it that it's jarring, but sell it in a way that it's natural, fits the world of the film, and yet offers up something different.
Absolutely. In the moment and in the aftermath of that moment, because there's some physical consequences to it that she has to then, well, she can't hide it. She has to explain it or play it off. And again, it balances that tone of levity and also like, what the hell is going on here? With like
exactly.
it's just done so well. I could say with confidence that this is at least top 3 for me. Maybe top 2.
Yeah.
I'm with you. Carol is such a great film, and her performance gives it such a great pathos that it might be my favorite of hers yet. But this is probably number 2 for me, with I'm Not There rounding out my top 3.
Okay, yeah, that's another good choice too.
But that is to say, I mean, she's great in everything that she does, and Blues Jasmine is absolutely a fantastic performance as well. But I do think it's up there. I do think this film is very much up there for sure.
Yeah.
And as I noted at the beginning of all of this, Tar is currently in my top 5. I'm sure we'll talk more about it here in about a month or so when we get to our year-end wrap-up.
Oh,
show.
award show stuff.
All right, let's move on to the next film we want to talk about. Let's talk a little Edward Berger. I think that's
Who is this guy?
Yeah.
Yeah, Edward Berger. Who is this guy? Where did he come from?
I do not know. That is a great question, but let's talk about his new film, All Quiet on the Western Front, starring Felix Kammerer as our central character of Paul. Obviously, this is a remake of not only a Best Picture winner, Brendan, but by a lot of accounts, one of the very best Picture winners.
Yeah, from 1930, I think
Yeah.
it was. It's one of the earliest ones, too.
One of the earliest ones. This is, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, the first German account of this story.
I think so, yeah.
I think that's been part of the marketing for this film. So let's talk about it. This is obviously about a young German soldier and the experiences he has on the Western Front during World War I. What did you think about this one, man?
You know, war films like this that are so brutal and uncompromising, I tend to get a little nervous every time I go into them because I feel like there seems to be this almost unspoken competition with war films competing to one up the other. And I sort of blame Saving Private Ryan for that, even though that wasn't its intent.
Yeah.
This is a film that is able to pretty much subvert that fear for me. And I think a lot of it is because of Felix Kammerer's performance, which I'm going to talk about first here. I know we're going to talk about Edward Berger's filmmaking, and the filmmaking here is great. I'm astounded that this guy basically came from very unknown backgrounds, I'll simply say, because he directs war sequences here with such consistent and like confident brutality that it almost seems like he's done it before at the very least. But where this film really works for me is watching this from the eyes of Paul. This is in some ways framed like a coming-of-age story. And I think it gives the film a personality that makes it stand apart from its modern war counterparts. There's a naivete and an innocence to Paul and his friends sort of joining this war because they think they need to and they think it's cool. They're looking forward to this.
Yeah.
They are excited about this.
Yeah.
Felix Kammerer and his friends, like they have this palpable joy about fighting for their country. And Edward Berger is very deliberate in not shying away from that, which obviously it's gonna, pull the rug from under our feet, or I should say, pull the rug from under their feet as they actually walk on enemy lines and enter the trenches there.
Yeah.
And I think in the brutality of it and just the overall innocence of it, this is where the film really worked for me. There are a few choices that are made narratively that I'm sure we'll talk about as I'm still wrestling with, mostly involving Daniel Bruhl and some of his scenes, which I don't hate. I'll simply say that. I'm still thinking about them. But as far as like discoveries go, both Edward Berger and Felix Kammerer are going to be names I remember by the end of the year as discoveries, especially Felix Kammerer. His performance, I think, is one of the best of the year. He really carries this movie, and I think he's great.
He is very good. The entire cast, I think, is excellent. Before we get to Edward Berger, though, another name I want to mention here, Volker Bertelmann. Forgive me, I'm butchering that. But the musical score to this film, oh my God. It
should not work. It should not
so
work.
Good.
I mean, what is that? I mean, we're talking about World War I here. So what is this, 1917, 1918, somewhere around this time frame?
Yep.
And you have this synthesizer industrial heavy score that almost sounds like it came from the band Rammstein or something like that. Yeah. Why does it work here?
I don't know. I cannot speak to the musical technicalities of it like you can, but yeah, that irony I do love. And the music here is so foreboding. It is so good. Mm-hmm. I tried to listen to it after watching the movie, not immediately, but let's say within the next day or so. And it was honestly a tough listen. Because it just immediately immerses you back into the movie, and it's so incredibly visceral. This is one of the most visceral experiences I've had in some time. Given the material it's adapting, you know what you're walking into, and yet it is still overwhelming. The filmmaking here by Berger is nothing short of sublime. The cinematography is incredible. I think it's one of the best shot films of the year. The sound design is haunting, coupled with that score, which, as we noted, has a morbid quality on its own. The editing here, I think, is absolutely incredible. I think of, and I know, I'm pretty sure Ryan noted this on the show when they talked about it. The tank moment is one of the most shattering moments I've experienced in a war film. It is so good. And I think part of it is the pragmatism of it, for one, the absolute dire nature of what Berger is trying to create here, and how the editing heightens that moment, right? Because circling back to the performances and what you were talking about there, I love that the tank moment comes off the heels of this brief but almost tranquil moment in the middle of a war zone. They're in the middle of a battle. It actually kind of reminded me, speaking of tanks, of Fury.
Oh, interesting.
Where in the middle of that movie, right, there's a moment where it pauses and we get this dinner scene with those characters. And the film examines what normalcy, like how important normalcy was to them during World War II. That's what Fury is about. It's really great. I love it. And you get a microcosm of that in this World War I scene where they're on the attack and they get into the French trenches and they stumble upon this room with all of this food.
Yeah.
And they take a break from the fighting and just start eating, which I think is incredible. And it certainly speaks to the feeble quality and living conditions. And obviously we know how poorish that was.
Right.
And so when they stumble into what, at least given the circumstances, what is this moment of normalcy, they take a break and they just indulge. And I love that. Only for moments later, or at the very end of that sequence, you hear the rumbling. You feel the rumbling. Everything is shaking. They go outside and these tanks are rolling overhead. And to speak to the performances, the way they react to these tanks, which they clearly have never seen before. This is the first time they've had their eyes on these things, and they are terrified.
And you sense it just in the way they look at it. And this is the other thing I love about these performances, especially from Felix Kammerer, is that during these moments of brutality, it's kind of dialogue free for the most part.
It is.
Most other, I guess, simpler war films like this that still may have a sense of brutality that they're trying to convey, the script would over-rely on character dialogue to convey that, rather than just the giftedness of these actors. And here, I do love that Edward Berger is choosing to remain rather silent during those sequences.
I agree. It is all about the terror and the fright and the uncertainty of what is about to take place. And the editing there, circling back to that, is what makes it, I think, as shattering as it is, coupled with those performances, because they do evoke that horror in some really great way. And then the way Berger cuts and showcases certain things regarding the tank, I'll say vaguely, it is incredibly bleak. And really gets to the pragmatism of what these soldiers would have experienced. And given the material here, we all know this story is about the bleakness of war. It's not the way it's been mystified or romanticized even. It is obviously the antithesis to that, and the material, even all the way back in 1930 when that original film was made, was trying to examine and highlight that.
Right.
And this film does it in a modern sense that I think is absolutely riveting and horrifying.
It is, and I really, really wish I had the chance to see this in a theater.
Oh, yeah.
And watching it at home, I did crank the volume a little bit more than I probably should have. I probably woke up my fiance a few times during the night watching it, but in a weird way, experiencing it at home on a smaller screen, it almost still felt like a 3D experience. And sometimes I think the best quote-unquote 3D films are ones that aren't even required to wear 3D glasses for, if that makes sense.
Sure.
And there are aspects here that I think it almost reaches that level. That tank scene specifically, there's one shot in particular where we actually see the tank from underneath. And I
that's
don't
the moment
think
I was talking about.
I don't think we've ever seen anything like that in a war film before.
Yeah.
At least in that way. And it honestly felt like my legs got run over. Like I actually had to lift my legs up thinking that I was about to get steamrolled, essentially. And this is on the comfort of my own couch, and yet the film is having such a visceral effect on me like that.
It is absolutely visceral. Yeah, some of the violence and the brutality here is incredible in the depiction, but I don't think it's ever gratuitous.
I agree. Yeah, and that's why I said earlier how there is almost like this unspoken competition with war films to sort of compete with one another on their brutality, because the easy thing to do is just be brutal for brutal's sake. And war absolutely is that. I mean, let's not get ahead of ourselves, but sometimes it comes off as gratuitous just for the sake of trying to do it better.
Yeah.
But here, there does seem to be a genuine purpose to it.
I agree. And it's done with, I don't know, it's weird to say these words, but it's done with this graceful assiduousness.
I was just going to say, there is something graceful about it.
Absolutely. Because there are much bloodier and gorier war movies out there than this one.
Yeah.
This doesn't hold back on that brutality, but it's not about gore. It doesn't want to get bogged down in that. It wants to get bogged down in the visceral, like that internal guttural menace that comes with war. And Berger nails that in ways that is incredibly impressive for a young filmmaker. This wasn't a directorial debut, but
no,
he hasn't made many movies, I don't think.
And he's never made anything on this scale before.
Absolutely. So let's talk about the political sparring here. I know that you were wavering on that a little bit. I will just come out and say that I love it. Now, this is a new addition to the material. This was not in the 1930 film. So, one, it does give this film texture that makes it distinctive, and I do like that as well. But also, I love how it gives the film this striking contradiction, right? Because you have these political figures trying to come to terms with peace, and there is absolutely no urgency to it whatsoever. There is this myopic lack of thinking about the soldier, aside from the Daniel Bruhl character, who even inside that context offers its own juxtaposition. But I do like how the political sparring gives the film weight as it relates to the battle and everything we just got done talking about and how ominous all of that is.
Yeah.
And given the weight of that, because of Berger's direction, you do come to feel the dire nature of it. And then here we have political figures just eating their croissants, and they're worried if the bagels are stale. And I don't know, should we come to peace? I don't know. We'll just make this quick walk through the forest. Like, there's no urgency to the matter.
Right.
And to me, that does give a lot of weight to this idea that the great dictator did a good job of in its own very different way of how disconnected leadership is, political leaders are from the battlefield, even though they are the reason those kids are there in the first place.
Yeah. I think I like the idea of these sequences more than the execution, because I like that they're here, and I like why they're here, to show what you're saying, the ignorance of political leaders and really the selfishness of them as well, who aren't anywhere near the front lines, yet still make decisions and choices for those literally dying for their country. I love that idea. I really do. I think it's maybe just I don't know. In the moment, maybe I found a certain repetition to them. Maybe that's kind of the point. You know, maybe it is meant to be very jarring in that way. But I think it was maybe just the fact that I don't know if I found those scenes compelling enough in a performative way. Like, I love Daniel Bruhl. I think he's a great actor. Maybe there's too much stiffness in the performances in those sequences for me, that it just kept making me want to go back to Felix Kammerer again. And I think it was just more in that sense. So maybe it's just a performative thing. But I love the idea that they're here. It's not something I would get rid of. That's not what I want to criticize about it. I think there's just something about the way it's conveyed that I did find a little bit deflating, if I'm being honest.
Okay. Yeah, I certainly did not have that experience. I think Daniel Bruhl is very good. I don't know if I disagree that there's, aside from Bruhl, I don't think Bruhl is stiff here at all, because he is really the only one of those characters that gives a shit, for the lack of a better term. Or better
He's
phrase.
the only moral one there, for sure.
He's the only one that understands, because he knows the stakes. He has experienced the consequences where many of those other political figures probably haven't. As I noted, they're very disconnected from the battlefield. Hell, even the general, the German general that we see here, he's completely disconnected, even though he's the one in charge of the damn army. So there is something about the stiffness of those characters, the uppityness of them, that I actually found very compelling, because there's an obvious juxtaposition on all fronts to what we're seeing there with the battle scenes, especially the lack of urgency. And you compare that to the utter urgency that the soldiers are experiencing, and it makes everything and how it all culminates for me, I think, all the more hefty in the end.
I think the stiffness in those other characters is perhaps necessary. I'm not going to argue against it. Maybe it's just a matter of it being a little too stiff. Maybe it was a little too properly conveyed. And I don't know. I guess I'm tripping up over my own words trying to find the reasons why I found those sequences a bit deflating. But there was that repetitive nature where I got what it was saying, and I love what it was saying, but I got to the point, and now where we're going to go from here. And I kind of felt like every time we cut back to Daniel Bruhl, it was essentially at the exact same spot saying the same thing once again. Well, and maybe it was just a little too static. I don't know.
Well, it's so interesting that you say it that way, because as you're talking there, I'm like, yeah, exactly. Yeah.
That's what's kind of interesting about this, right? It's like I'm criticizing it for doing its job successfully, I guess.
Because when you're talking about how where do we go from here? That's it. That's exactly it. Where do we go from here? Why can't we get this done? The lack of urgency, the lack of getting nowhere, the redundancy of it all is the point. That is exactly what Daniel Bruhl is fighting for. That redundancy. Let's fight that. Let's fight the mundanity of this.
I guess the question is, and this is maybe a general question we can be asking all movie makers, is it possible to convey redundancy without being redundant?
I don't know.
It's a pretty interesting question, right?
It is a very interesting question, and I think that's why I never felt the redundancy of it, or at least I never sensed that as a bad thing. I always looked at those scenes, the mundanity of them. Maybe some of the little details that Berger sprinkles in there, like one of the political figures asking if, how old are these bagels? Oh, they're a day old. It's that little stuff.
That's one line I did love. Maybe I just wanted more of that, where it almost became like this weird satire of sorts, because that
kind of functions as that in a weird little way.
It's a funny line.
Absolutely. And, I like the nuance of Bruhl and the emotional pathos he brings to his character. So there are aspects to those sequences that I do think give the film this really refreshing quality that I do like. That, again, makes it distinctive, if nothing else. But to me, it adds weight. I wholeheartedly love those scenes. I think they heighten this movie to a new degree.
Yeah, and I'm glad they're at least here. I don't think removing them would fix my issue, because then you're left with a movie that I feel like is conveying a pretty pedestrian anti-war message. I think this does add a more interesting component to a movie like this. So having them here is, I don't want to say it's necessary, but I think it is interesting in what it has on its mind. And I like that they're here. Maybe I'm just a little torn on the way it's executed.
Okay. Either way, we're both high on the film. I do.
Oh, it's a very good movie. I gave it 3.5 out of 5 on Letterboxd, but in actuality, it's probably more of a 4, because it's just too well made, especially in those sequences involving the actual front lines. That it's going to be in the conversation when it comes to technical achievements of the year. At least I think it should be.
This is currently in my top 10, and you better goddamn believe it. That score will end up in my top 5. I cannot fathom that it won't.
It might for me as well. It might be my favorite score of the year so far.
It's so
honestly.
Good. It is so good. Yeah. All right, let's talk about Park Chan-wook's decision to leave. So you and I were both really high on The Handmaiden when that came out. We've been anticipating this film for quite some time as well. It is about a detective investigating the death of a man in the mountains, and he meets the man's mysterious wife in the course of this dogged sleuthing. I'm really glad that someone wrote that. That's very exciting.
I was going to say, did you come up with that? That's pretty good.
No, IMDb wrote that for me, and it's very good. I'm not going to lie. So with that said, Brennan, I'm actually really curious to hear what you think, because going into the year, I can't remember if this made your top 10 or not, but I think you were a little higher in your anticipation than I am, even though I was very much anticipating this as well.
Yeah, I think I was high in it because of how much I love The Handmaiden. Back when we did our top 10 of the decade, last decade specifically, I had The Handmaiden in my top 10. And it's honestly one I think I've liked even more as time has gone on. It might even make my top 5 of the decade now that I think about it.
Wow. It was in my top 10 the year that it came out. So I'm also very high on that movie. Love Park Chan-wook's filmography on the whole. Really good director. So that is to say, obviously we were anticipating this, but now that we've seen it, what did you think about it?
I don't know what to make of it. I'm really curious what this conversation is going to be, but I'll say this. While I don't know what to make of it, I do know that this was so my jam. This was still my jam. I don't think it's as good as The Handmaiden. I think it's not only a very different film from The Handmaiden, but it's also a very different film for Park Chan-wook. It doesn't have the the brutality or the gruesomeness that you normally get from a movie like Old Boy or the other films within the Vengeance trilogy or Thirst or even The Handmaiden to a certain extent. There's more of a sophistication here, a quietness to it. I wouldn't necessarily say it's more mature, but there is a more somber quality that is a bit of a change of pace for him that I really did like, but it still feels like it has the energy of a Park Chan-wook film. It has the tension of a film of his, while also surprising you at almost every turn.
Yeah.
It moves in an almost like insomniatic way, and I guess that's purposeful because it mirrors the sleep-deprived headspace of our main character, so it leaves so much room for confusion and despondency without really knowing what's going on. I mean, there are scenes that I thought were clear flashbacks, only to then realize they weren't. And at one point, I thought the film was even being told out of order. That probably makes the film sound utterly terrible, but I ate that up. I still don't know what to make of the film thematically. I think there is an allegory here that we'll certainly talk about as this conversation goes, but from a filmmaking standpoint, as far as a sonic experience, I love this film, and I think at its core is a very heartfelt romance. This is a very good romance film. So we'll talk about the performances and how they convey that, but in all of those ways, this is one of my favorite films of the year, too. I'm not sure if I know 100% why that is. I was just able to vibe with it.
No, that is exactly my reaction to it as well. I walked out thinking, I really love that. And also, I cannot articulate why exactly, but it is very good. This is one of those films where I'm really high on it. It's not currently in my top 10, but I don't think it would take much to talk me into it, if that makes sense, because I'm still also grappling with its complexities, its mystery, the story structure here, which, as you noted, can be a little jarring at first because there are sequences that play out, and initially it's a sleight of hand. I don't know if that's more on us or if that's intentional on Park Chan-wook to perhaps trick us into thinking that what you're seeing is out of order or these are flashback sequences when in reality they're not. I don't really know. I'd have to rewatch the film. I will say this, though. The mystery and the romance at the core of this film is so bizarre, yet so striking and mesmerizing. There are these constant twists and turns that are so baffling, yet simultaneously you watch how they play out and you can't help but admire the cleverness of them as well. And I love the journey that Park Chan-wook takes us on in that regard. Maybe the thing I'm most wrestling with, and I don't know if a conversation will do it justice. It might be one of those things where I just have to rewatch it before we do our year-end stuff again. Because I do wonder about how the romance blossoms. I think initially it makes a lot of sense given the home life of our detective character here and this woman that he comes across. There's an action that takes place halfway through the film that is kind of incredible.
Yeah.
I do love it. And then it takes a little bit of a turn, and how the romance evolves from there, I don't know if it gets to the point where, given where it ends, if all of that makes sense to me. I don't know. I mean, it makes sense, but I don't know if I would react the same way he does. I'll just say that.
Is the emotional justification.
The emotional justification. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah. Yeah, I see what you mean, and that's something I am still wrestling with as well, and I think it was really more of a credit to these two performances as to why I was able to feel what I think the film was wanting to convey.
Yeah.
And these two lead performances here being Park Hae-il as our lead detective, and then Tong Wei as the female subject that he is investigating, that becomes intertwined in his life, I'll simply say. And I'll simply say that Tong Wei especially gives one of my favorite performances of the year.
She's absolutely terrific.
Yeah, their relationship reminded me of what is clearly one of this film's biggest influences, and that's Alfred Hitchcock's Vertigo. But with that film, of course, Jimmy Stewart and Kim Novak there's a lot of confusion as far as that relationship. I mean, I think it's a little bit more spelled out in that film. Not to that film's discredit. It's just doing something narratively a bit more direct and a little different. But here, I think the push and pull between them is almost working in a similar way. And I did kind of sense this this despondency in one character in particular, that character of Jang Hae-jun, the Park Hae-il character, and then how that despondency kind of shifts midway through, as you're saying. This very much is a tale of two halves, so the roles kind of shift at a certain point, and I did find that interesting. I think these performances are what sells the romance for me, because by the end, I was kind of devastated by what happens. And like you, I wasn't sure if I could fully back up the emotional justification from a narrative standpoint, but I felt it. And I think that's all I needed for it to work for me.
Yeah, I did feel it as well. And I am with you that I think it's wholly on the performances, or mostly on the performances. They are very good. And they give credence to the emotional volatility of these characters that absolutely crystallizes in this fascinating way. Like, dramatically speaking, those last few sequences are stunning.
They are.
And this is one of the best endings of the year, hands down.
Yeah.
Not even close.
I feel like we're saying that a lot about these movies. I'm looking at my my current top 10 as it is. They all have a common theme. They all end perfectly.
Yeah, this has a phenomenal ending, even if, again, the emotional roller coaster of it all, the emotional justification, I still don't know if it's there, but dramatically, I am compelled by it. Performatively, I am very much compelled by it as well. I just don't know if the emotion is there because, and I'm be curious to hear what you think about this specifically, so much of the emotional tethering of these characters comes down to one line of dialogue at that midway point before things turn in a very different direction. And that line of dialogue, while it does come through very well in the performance, from a plotting perspective, from a motive perspective, so much of what Song Se-rae is doing throughout this film comes down to her manipulating the Jang Hae-jun character. And it does seem as if up until the last second, that is what she's doing. It is all about that manipulation. And then she hears a line of dialogue that perhaps makes her reflect on what she's doing. Is that enough to give the film weight emotionally in terms of the romanticism? I don't know.
I think on the page, maybe not, but I think it does work in the performances.
Okay.
Because in those performances, I did get a sense of her responding to something that she just never had in a past relationship. This sense of one actually looking to protect her, someone that was actually looking, and I think that's sort of the essence of this relationship, of someone that's honestly looking out for someone else, and that's really the relationship at the core of this, and how that then juxtaposes Jang Hae-jun's own marriage and how that doesn't exist in his marriage. It's very despondent, very disconnected, and in a way, Song Se-rae senses that in our main character as well. There's a lot of push and pull going on.
I agree, and maybe that is the brilliance of Park Chan. What maybe it's supposed to work and not work, in the sense that yes, Jang Hae-jun, his relationship with his wife is pretty non-existent, or it's pretty dull and mundane. And when it comes to Song Se Ray, she's never really had, at least with what the film gives us, the information it tells us about her, she's never had a real relationship. Everything about her relationships have been manufactured because of where she comes from and how much of an outlier she is in South Korea.
Yeah.
And the film does go out of its way to depict that, or to show us that in some ways, whether it be the relationship she had with her husband, whose death is the cipher for much of the plotting in the first half of the film.
Right.
But that relationship, we do know, was manufactured to a degree. And then the relationship she's involved in the back half of the film is also a facade. There's not much about it that is real to her, right? So you have two characters that aren't in any sort of real relationship, nothing that means anything to them. So there's something about them coming together to have a fake relationship themselves, but also it's real to them at the same time. Maybe that duality is exactly the point. Maybe it is, in terms of the meta quality here, in terms of the writing, maybe it is supposed to work and not work.
I think that's why at first it's not really a relationship until that line of dialogue, like you're saying, when Tang Wei's character is able to sense something new in this whole dynamic. She almost goes from manipulator to manipulate T, if that makes sense. By the time we get to that midway point, it's sort of a transfer of the wand, if you will, in some ways. By the time we get to that next half, it's very much a Tale of Two Halves movie, and it's something I really do like about it. But I think the fact that she has never received that type of love before in her life, and the fact that she's also a Chinese immigrant in this situation, the film sort of indirectly has some thoughts there about immigration and Asian culture and being a bit disconnected to that, to the point that you might feel a little bit lonely. I think that plays a part in conveying the emotion that we need, even if on the page it's not necessarily giving us that. This is really more of a movie that, performance-wise and direction-wise, it gives us what we need. And I, in a way, I like movies that can elevate the gaps of the script if that is what they're meant to do.
And ultimately, I think that's why the film is very good and very effective. That emotional justification and trying to find a nucleus for that is really my only criticism here.
Okay.
It's the only thing holding me back from wholly falling in love with the film. But beyond that, I'm completely in agreement with you. The direction here, the performances are so good. The mystery, the tug and more of it all, I think is absolutely fascinating. You think you know where it's going, and then in the next moment, it just completely pulls the rug out from under you. And I do love how Park Chan-wook handles all of that. The mystery never overtakes that romance, though. I
agree.
That is important in terms of, giving us a compelling drama here, but never at the disservice of these characters, their motives, and how and why they're drawn to each other.
Which is a testament to these performances as well, right? Because while I did say this is perhaps a more subdued offering from Park Chan-wook by comparison to his other films, this still has moments of being a loud mystery thriller. There are moments where it's very thrilling. Some of the cinematography here by Kim Ji-young is absolutely incredible in the way it captures frames and movements like no other film this year. One rooftop scene specifically that involves a chase on foot, I'll say.
Yeah.
It is amazing, and it's probably the loudest thing in the movie physically, but the fact that we have scenes like that and the romance is still primary to this entire thing is a testament to how good the performances are.
I completely agree. And much like Tar that we mentioned earlier, while it has this dramatic, grounded sensibility that pushes things forward, there's some great humor here as well. Some nice comedic lines of dialogue or interactions that give the film this full-rounded experience to it. So I do like the humor here when it does come. It's subtle. There isn't too much of it, but it is, placed here when it needs to. And, mostly this comes down to the performances more than anything else. Ting Wei especially gives one of the better performances of the year.
Yeah, she'll probably end up in my top 5 when we get to the award season.
Very much in that conversation for me as well. Yeah, I really, really do love that film. All right, let's move on to the next film we want to talk about here. Let's talk a little RRR, shall we?
Well, you will. I sadly didn't get a chance to see this one yet.
Okay, I'm going to talk a little RRR. I guess I'll be brief here, especially since Brendan hasn't seen it yet. And I don't know what else to say that hasn't already been said.
So you hated this as well, didn't you?
No, it is absolutely bonkers. It is absolutely insane. I love how over the top it is. It has, it's like a concoction of La La Land and Guy Ritchie and Marvel, all inside the bubble of a Bollywood movie. That's maybe the best way for me to phrase it.
There's a poll quote for this one.
I mean, it has all of those qualities because it is a musical on one hand, and I do love that the soundtrack, not only does it inject this riveting energy into the film, but the dialogue of many of these songs actually speak to the plot, which is not always the case, or is rarely the case, really. That's what makes it more like a musical rather than a song from a band, let's say, that a movie loves to use. I mean, Ryan and Sophia just got done with their Martin Scorsese series. Scorsese, very much known for injecting songs more so than score. He hasn't used a ton of score in his movies. He loves to use songs. And this film uses song, but the songs, like the verbiage of them is written more like a musical. So it's really interesting how the film uses music here to not only give the film energy, but to actually give the film context. So it's really fascinating in that regard. Then the style of it is very Guy Ritchie-esque in terms of, slow motion or like these really over stylized tactics that he uses in his movies. And again, I love that here. I actually say that as a good thing. Just the over top nature of the action sequences is insane. I mean, there's one sequence here where one of the characters jumps over a fence and without hyperbole fights off like 200 guys. At least, maybe more. Like, there's no plausibility to it whatsoever. It's one of those where if that was to happen, he's dead in 2 minutes, right? But instead, it's like, again, that's why I bring up something like Marvel, because it has like that Marvel quality where these guys are almost like superheroes more so than they are like tangible characters.
Interesting.
And it's just so much fun. Like, it's just absolutely ridiculous and that. But then at the core of this movie, and obviously I am not from India, the historical context of this film is something that I am absolutely not an expert on. So I won't speak to it too much, but the villains here are the English colonizers that were there in the 1920s. And so there's like this sense of gratification of overcoming that colonialism that I think is pretty affable and done really wonderfully as well. And yeah, I just think it's all done with incredible vision, the cinematography, the use of CG with the animals, again, a little overly done, perhaps, but that's part of the charm as well.
I was going to say it seems deliberate.
I think it is. It is absolutely deliberate, partially because they didn't want to use real animals for ethical reasons.
Sure.
But even within the CGI, it's not like they were trying to render, let's say, the tiger from Life of Pi, where that was trying to be more grounded, give a realistic sensibility. The CGI here, again, to your point, probably intentionally a little over the top, but not cartoonish. It's not overly cartoonish.
Yeah, it's almost like this case where you realize, okay, the budget's not here to make it 100% realistic, so why bother trying?
Exactly.
It's like, we know what we have to do to convey this. Let's have a little fun with how we convey it.
Yeah, absolutely. And as we just got done talking about with Decision to Leave, I'm going to butcher these names, but I have to try. N.T. Rama Rao Jr. and Ram Charan Teja, our central characters here, are so good. Their chemistry is remarkable. It is unbelievable, the tension between these characters. And obviously not a romantic tension, but still an intimate connection. The friendship that they reverberate here is incredible. It is really, really great and a driving force for so much of this film, because in many ways, and maybe it's a little bit ironic, it does function a little bit like a Romeo and Juliet. Because you have two characters, one that works for the English police, another that has been hired by this Indian tribe that was transgressed against by the English colonizers, and they are opposites. They do not belong together as a result, but because of the friendship and the camaraderie that is formed, it kind of functions in the same way as Romeo and Juliet, except, spoiler alert, the ending is different.
Okay. Well, I guess that's good.
I'm just trying to have fun here, because I'm trying to articulate it in a way that isn't
probably
just
the movie
me
would want, right?
regurgitating.
I feel like it's what the movie would want you to do.
Because look, everyone has already talked. Like, we are months late to this movie, like months late. Everyone's already talked about it, and I can only echo and regurgitate what everyone has already said. It is a phenomenal movie. It is a ton of fun. It is the most fun you'll have all year. And I just cannot recommend it enough.
Yeah, there's a review on Letterboxd by Patrick Willems. I don't know if you've seen this one, JD. Yeah. He says RRR is the best action movie of the year, the best musical of the year, the best romantic comedy of the year, the best historical drama of the year, and the best movie ever made about fighting colonialism with dance battles and armies of rampaging animals, and most of all, friendship.
And didn't I just basically lay all that out in the last
You basically
10 minutes?
did, yeah. And I was reading through these. It's like, wow, JD is fully describing that. Not to say you plagiarized it, because I know you didn't, but it just proves that I feel like everyone is having the exact same reaction here.
Yeah. But that absolutely nails it in a nutshell. That's what it is, and it's really great.
Cool.
The
I gotta catch up with it soon.
The soundtrack is really good. In terms of awards at the end of the year, there will be songs that are likely in contention for me, for sure. So that I'll certainly highlight when we get to the awards. But yeah, it's
all right.
It's an endlessly magnetic film. Cannot recommend that one enough. Should we talk a little Triangle of Sadness?
If you want, again, this is one I sadly didn't get a chance to watch either. I didn't realize its limited run in theaters was ending the day after that I wanted to see it. Or I should say the day before, I guess. That would be the timing accuracy there. But I wanted to see it a certain date, and it had ended the day before, so I didn't get a chance to see it.
Yeah, so I'll keep this pretty brief. I do like Triangle of Sadness. I know our great friend Ryan McQuaid, I don't know if he's ever going to listen to this. He seemingly loathes this movie.
Well, it
based
seems
off
to be
of some
having a
of his
pretty
reaction.
divisive response. I feel like
Yeah.
you and Ryan are sort of emblematic of the two sides that people
Yeah.
are having with this one.
Yeah, I don't think it's great. This isn't going to end up in my top 10 or even my top 20. I feel about it the same way I do Robin Uslin's The Square from 2016, I believe that was. In the sense that
yeah.
I think there are a lot of good things here, but I don't think it's quite there in terms of fully realizing its ideas. What's interesting about Triangle of Sadness is that there are three very distinct acts to this movie. The first one takes place between Carl and his girlfriend, Yaya. And it's setting up who those characters are. It spends most of the time with them at this restaurant where they're having a little bit of an argument over who's going to pay for dinner and how that works within their relationship. And they're arguing about that on the drive home. And then it closes with them still arguing and figuring out their relationship inside their apartment. And then we quickly move to, and if you've seen the trailer, you know where this is going, where these characters find themselves on a yacht. And it's briefly explained how Carl and Yaya are on the yacht, but it's more than just them. There are a bunch of couples on this yacht. There's the captain, played wonderfully by Woody Harrelson, of all people. Mm-hmm. And this is where the film is satirical in its most comedic form. And I do think it's very funny.
Okay.
Earlier, you were talking about Tar and its tonal juxtapositions. I cannot begin to emphasize the tonal dualities of this film. It is insanely jarring because this middle sequence is incredibly comedic, a little over the top, especially with how it crystallizes. Maybe I shouldn't go into too much detail, but there is a lot of...
I think I've heard what kind of stuff happens in this second act. A lot of, let's say, mouthly projectile stuff.
Uh-huh. Yep, some bodily fluids are expunged here.
Okay.
That is for sure. I also want to give Oslin some credit because his direction in all of that, while it is over the top and perhaps a little ostentatious, but in a comedic way that I think is actually pretty effective. One of the more interesting elements of his direction there is when the ship finds themselves in these really bumpy waves, which is what is the cipher for all of the bodily fluids. The boat is constantly rocking at these deep angles. And throughout much of that sequence, Oslin mimics that rocking with the camera. So the camera is constantly tilting at a 45-degree angle and going back and forth as if you're on the boat. And it does give you a little bit of this sickening feeling. If you struggle with motion sickness, do not watch this movie. Don't. Or you'll find yourself doing the same things as these characters are.
That's pretty incredible.
So,
again, a 3D movie without being a 3D movie.
Exactly. I found that pretty effective because our family, my wife's family, we love to do cruises. Go ahead and judge us for that all if you want. Now, we're on big cruise ships, so it's much bigger than what these characters are experiencing. But when you're out in the ocean, you're going to experience that rocking. And I got the same feeling watching this movie to a more heightened degree, obviously, as I do when we're out on those cruise ships in the ocean. So I say that to say I think Austin's filmmaking does a good job of heightening and amplifying what these characters are experiencing, why they are having these symptoms, these projectile things happening to them. I'll say, I guess. And it's all done with this comedic tone. And it's great. And then that sequence ends. And then you get to the final sequence, which takes place on this beach where many of these characters continue on, and the tone is very different. It is much more grounded. It's more dire. It's a little bit more serious. There's some comedic element to it, but it's mostly a conventional drama at that point. There's still a little bit of satire there, but the tone isn't over the top. It's not goofy. It's not Wolf of Wall Street like the middle sequences. It is much more grounded in reality. And it's really effective on its own terms. In fact, if you take that third sequence, that third act, and just make its own film out of that, I think it's actually one of the best movies of the year. I think it's really good.
So it sounds like a trio of 3 really good short films that don't necessarily work together
100%.
Collectively.
Absolutely. Okay. Now, the first sequence, I could take it or leave it. It's fine.
Okay.
I don't think it's great, but it's not terrible either. The second act, I think it's very good for all the reasons I just talked about. And then the third sequence, I think, is even better. But do they gel together? Absolutely not. And that's the problem. That is the problem. I think on their own terms, you're right. Really good short films that have obviously similar commentary to them, but not very seamless in transition. And that's what makes the film such a jarring experience. And I don't know if that works. For me, it didn't wholly work. But as I noted at the beginning of this, the film on the whole, I do like, I just don't love because of how uneven the transitions are.
And that kind of worries me because I feel like historically speaking, JD, I've been harder on films that have that problem than you have. So means I might like it even less than you, even if I like the individual components. But what you're describing sounds interesting. I just, I worry if I'm going to like the final product now because I have been harder on films that tend to be narratively inconsistent on the whole. And it sounds like that's the case. I will say, to change subjects just a little bit here, I was looking at the cast list. The young actress who plays one of the main characters here, Sharby Dean, I think it is, plays with the main character's girlfriend, if I'm not mistaken. Apparently she passed away earlier this year before the film actually had its premiere, and I didn't know anything about that. That's really sad.
That is sad. I'm not sure if I knew that or not. I don't think I realized that either. So that is really sad to hear. I will say real quickly, and then we can move on, in terms of the satire. I think it's a little bit twofold for me in the sense that the second act and what Aslan does in terms of, the commentary on classism, there is nothing new about what he's doing there. To me, It's all about the execution. It's about the fun and the levity of it. That's what makes it compelling. The third act, I think he's actually trying to do something, and he's doing it in a really fascinating way. Because again, you have these characters that come from various backgrounds stuck on this beach together, and yet the one in charge is the character that knows how to survive on their own terms. And I'll give you one guess who that is. It's not the rich.
Yeah.
It's the low-class worker who has worked with her hands all her life and has worked to the bone and knows how to survive without others around her, lifting her up. And that's what makes Dolly De Leon's performance so fascinating. Honestly, one of the better supporting, I guess you would label it, performances of the year so far. She's really good because she finds herself with power for the first time in her life. And the way she goes about exhibiting that power and trying to maintain that power because of how that classism is flipped, I think is really compelling, especially given the ironies that Aslan gives us at the end of the film. It's really great. That third act is truly wonderful filmmaking. I wish the whole film was that.
Sure.
But it's Ruben Aslan, and that's not his jam. So
I'm starting to sense even more, I guess, timeliness and maybe irony in the fact that this is called Triangle of Sadness, and it's not because it's a 3-act movie like you're saying. That does seem pretty deliberate if my assumption is to be
there's a
made correct.
clear path there for sure.
But in some ways, I feel like we've had a triangle of movies depicting these same themes. You have Triangle of Sadness, you had The Menu, and then Glass Onion, a Knives Out story. So it's like we have this unofficial trilogy on eating the rich, literally.
Yeah. And I haven't seen The Menu yet. I know that was the film that Ryan was comparing this to because he brought it up when you guys reviewed The Menu, another one of those that I sadly haven't got a chance to see yet.
Sure.
So I can't speak to how better The Menu is compared to this. And it might be a better movie because of how disjointed this film is, but it's very clearly doing three different things. And how that is going to work for you from a tonal perspective is really up to the viewer. I did not mind it, but it is what holds it from being anything meaningful at the end of the day. The third act is
Makes
meaningful.
sense.
I think there's some true insight and some compelling filmmaking going on there. The second act is just really fun. And so ultimately, that's all this film is. Kind of slight in the grand scheme of it all.
Yeah, I gotcha. I'm still looking forward to checking it out because it sounds like there's nothing else like it this year.
Yeah. If anything else, that's a good reason to watch the movie. It's Ruben Östlund, and he does things that very few other filmmakers do. Like that second sequence with them there on the yacht, in terms of how brazen and odd it is very reminiscent of the scene in the square at the dinner and the monkey business that's going on there. I'll just say.
I gotcha. Okay.
If you know what I mean, if you know the scene that I'm talking about, I think that reference will make a lot of sense there. So,
Alrighty.
Okay, let's move on. Let's talk about this Weird Al movie.
This weird movie.
The Al Yankovic story that is a biopic, but not a biopic because it's Weird Al. This is something you also got a chance to see. So, Brendan, what did you think about this one?
Yeah, so we'll both get a chance to talk about this one. I thought this was pretty effective. I think really if there's any disparity we have on this movie, JD, and I'm not sure if there will be, it's really just a matter of taste because this kind of comedy, I mean, comedy is always subjective, but I feel like this type of comedy is even more subjective than any other broader form of comedy, right? Because this is definitely riding on the coattails of movies like Walk Hard and Pop Star, Never Stop, Never Stopping.
Yep.
But when it leans so heavily into its absurdity, Weird Al specifically, or Weird, the Al Yankovic story, this is where I just can't help but laugh at the film. And I mean, I guess I should say laugh with it. Laughing at it, I feel like just has this negative connotation. I was laughing with this movie for most of its runtime. Perhaps it does overstay its welcome a little bit for me, but again, that's more of a matter of taste than anything else. But there are moments I did crack up, not just at the overall intent of this movie, but just the way dialogue is exchanged that I think is really clever at times. There's one moment where Al performs on stage with his roommates, and he asks them, "Why didn't you tell me you all could play?" And one of them replies with, "It didn't seem relevant until now."
I love that.
So it's in those moments when it is certainly ripping on the the Bohemian Rhapsodies of the world that I did find it clever because it finds this broadness to make fun of. It's not making fun of specific attributes. Some of those moments when it gets a little bit specific didn't always work for me. I'll give one example later, but for the most part, I thought this was really funny. It's not going to be anywhere near one of my favorite movies of the year, but I did have a lot of fun with the absurdity of it. And Daniel Radcliffe, very committed to the bit. I think he's good here.
Yeah, this is an absolute riot of a film. It's exactly the kind of quote-unquote biopic you would expect for someone like Al Yankovic. It goes out of its way to parody the formula, and that on its own terms I do think is clever, but the fact that it simultaneously treats that subversion with sincerity, I think is also hilarious. And to me, I think
there is a tender quality to this movie.
And
You're right.
To me, that's what is so distinctive about it. Yes, it is absolutely insane. It is absurd. The parody element of it is often really funny. And yet there is this poignant sincerity that I just did not expect, given that we knew going in that this was going to be a parody biopic.
Right.
And I love that combination. I absolutely ate that up, especially because of Daniel Radcliffe. And I completely agree with you. Very committed to the role here. He's really having the time of his life and is very good as a result. And so at times while I was laughing with this film, I was chuckling at the buffoonery of it. That scene we get, not quite halfway through the film, that party sequence there by the pool where you get a bajillion cameos.
Okay, yeah, I have thoughts on that one.
There's so much happening there. You're like, what is going on here? Like, there's just so much to the film that is baffling. At one point, we go to, Cuba or somewhere in South America. Like, it's absolutely...
Oh, yeah. Pablo Escobar actually has a part here. Not the real Pablo Escobar, but the quote-unquote character of Pablo Escobar.
Absolutely. Or that final scene on stage. We've talked a lot about endings to movies. That ending scene and how that is subversive all on its own.
Oh, it's jarring, and it's not that it ends on a bit of a mockery of sorts. It's that it just literally ends. Like, you want to talk about being committed to the bit. You end on a literal joke, and you don't even acknowledge the joke. It's almost like you're grasping for air by that point. It's so strange. But
it is so strange.
I'm with you. I do like the ending as well.
But and it's weird, Al. So you have to expect the weird, and this film does deliver on that. But that's also what makes the sincerity, I think, all the more hefty, because you don't expect that, and ultimately that is the arc of Al Yankovic here, is that he wants to make his music. He wants to do it his way. And much of that is also rooted in wanting to do something that will make his parents proud. And there's nothing disingenuous about that. I mean, talk about a tonal disparity that with some of these other films we've talked about, maybe it doesn't work. I did find that effective in this movie.
Yeah, I think it is mostly effective. You brought up the pool scene where we have all of these endless cameos. This scene is both one that really worked for me, while also being maybe my least favorite scene of the entire year.
Okay.
There's a specific moment about it that really rubbed me the wrong way.
Okay.
We obviously won't give away all of these cameos, but I will give away one of them, and it's not a major cameo. But we do get actor... I don't even know if I know how to pronounce his last name. David Dasmalchian. We've seen him in a lot of movies directed by Denis Villeneuve. We saw him as Polka Dot Man in The Suicide Squad from James Gunn.
Okay, yeah.
He plays John Deacon, the bass player from Queen. So maybe this is just more subjective. But the way that he's integrated here, I think is so borderline distasteful, I almost puked. And the reason why is because John Deacon, who, as I said, the bass player from Queen, he's one of my favorite bass players. Queen is one of my all-time favorite bands. In real life, he is someone that suffers from such stress and anxiety over the passing of Freddie Mercury that he has completely given up on music. To this day, he can't handle the stress. There are videos of people asking for autographs from him, and he just freaks out. He is completely in the backlight now. Why the is he in this movie? Because it implies that somehow John Deacon had something to do with the train wreck that was Bohemian Rhapsody. He did not. He had nothing to do with that. So the fact that that character is here, I mean, I flipped the bird so hard I almost broke my finger. I mean, I really did. And I don't think that was the intent. But I think choosing that character or that person to have here is so wrong. I think it's so wrong. And I think in this case, Weird Al should be ashamed of himself.
Wow. I can't remember the last time I had to use the bleep button on Brendan. It's been a while.
Now, okay.
Wow.
I might be one of the few who feels this way because I'm coming from a very personal place with regards to my being a musician and me loving this band.
Yeah.
So I'm willing to admit I'm in a small minority here, but I think it was severely the wrong choice to convey that kind of message. You could have had Roger Taylor or Brian May in that moment and still convey the same thing. But it inadvertently implies that someone like John Deacon was tied to Bohemian Rhapsody, the movie. And I don't think that is the right call.
Okay, that is very fair. I obviously did not have that context when watching this movie. And so I didn't respond to it the same way that Brendan just laid out there.
I'm passionate, man. I got so passionate there.
I mean, that makes sense. And I've certainly had my fair share of those kinds of reactions. And who knows? I mean, we're going to be talking about Devotion here on the show soon. I haven't seen that film yet, but will that film do the same thing with dogfighting that I know of, where you might not have that same context?
Will that be your historical Olympus Has Fallen?
Maybe. Maybe. Yeah. So that's always certainly possible. I do understand that. I obviously did not have that context, but I can absolutely empathize with what you're saying there. And again, I don't think anyone is arguing that this film is perfect anyway. It's a far cry from that.
No, I just had to vent about one scene that rubbed me the wrong way. But I mean, mostly that scene at the pool, at least the endless cameos, it's distracting, but in a way that knows it's distracting.
Yeah.
So I was okay with it.
Yeah, I do think it's really funny with the progression of it and how it, eventually plays out, kind of leading to him getting his big deal and then the stardom that comes with it and the downfall and all of the playfulness we get with Madonna. And it's debauchery.
Yeah, and Rachel Wood, also very good in the film. I heard many interviews with both Al Yankovic himself as well as Daniel Radcliffe talking about how Evan Rachel Wood is actually a very good singer in real life. Apparently they discovered that at some karaoke night, and yet they didn't have her sing in this movie.
Yeah.
And they were kind of regretful about that. But in a way, I kind of like that she doesn't, because it is such a far cry from Madonna herself that I kind of appreciate that she's playing a caricature here.
And I do love the simple fact that, and we know this is the case with Weird Al, that bands have loved when he parodies their songs, because then those original songs become popular again and they become downloaded and people buy them. And that is ultimately the plot of this film. Yeah.
Except apparently Weird Al, good songwriter as well, because he wrote Beat It, apparently.
Yeah. That was so good. Yeah, I love that little twist there. Some playful irony.
I did not expect that. I will give the film credit for surprising
I did not expect that. Michael Jackson stole from me? Incredible. So yeah, I do think this film is really funny. One of the funniest films of the year for me. Really clever, really playful. And again, that sincerity. I can't help but think about that scene with his father there near the end at the factory. It is from a directional tonal perspective, it is handled like a genuine drama or like a genuine connection between a father and a son. And I joked with you guys that the film made me cry. And I mean, I couldn't help myself. Like I certainly did not have like a midnight special kind of reaction to it, but I certainly felt it. And I just, again, it's one of those things you don't expect in a movie like this.
It's kind of like in Deadpool 2, you found yourself moved by it, but you couldn't tell if you were just falling for the joke or not, right?
Exactly. Yeah, 100%. Yeah. That's a really great comparison there.
I have to say, I was a little bit, I don't want to say disappointed, but I was sort of half expecting there to be this like hilarious reveal of what that factory actually made, and I was expecting it to be accordions or something like that.
That would be funny.
That would have been funny. I'm not saying it's a missed opportunity, but maybe I'm also saying it was a missed opportunity. So, Al, if you want to make another movie, I'll help co-write it for you someday.
There you go. All right, so that is Weird Al, his quote-unquote biopic. And I will say also, one last note, the mimicry, the mocking of the poster to Bohemian Rhapsody is some of the best marketing of the year.
Yeah,
that poster is so. I just love the brazenness of it.
I was a little unsure about it at first, but after seeing the movie and knowing how brazen that it was, I was able to get behind it then.
Yeah, I love it. All right, so two more quickly that I want to talk about. So a few weeks ago on Extra Film, Ryan and Sophia talked about She Said. And this is, of course, the movie that goes into Harvey Weinstein and everything that led up to him being written about in the New York Times in 2017 was that, I believe, when that piece was written, ultimately leading to more women coming out and then ultimately leading to his arrest. And I actually really like this movie. It is conventional in terms of structure, and I think that formula will be mundane for a lot of people. But I think that simplicity also allows for the material to resonate more loudly. And to me, that's what's most important here. This isn't a movie that should be directed by, let's say, Terrence Malick or someone trying to be Terrence Malick. This needs to be as bare bones as possible. In fact, I think where the film maybe falters a little bit is when Maria Schrader tries to do maybe a little bit too much in her direction. There's a couple of characters here talking about their experiences where she interweaves that dialogue with flashbacks, and it's a little bit jarring because she's not very consistent in that tactic. It is a little jarring when it does come. I don't know if that's wholly necessary, but at the same time, to visually showcase some of the distress these characters are talking about, I do understand why she does. So simultaneously, it does work, but why she chooses some characters over others, that I don't know. That to me is the question mark with doing something like that. But for the most part, the structure here is formulaic, it's simple, and I think this film needed that so it could just be about what this story is in terms of sexual abuse and Hollywood and how they've perpetrated those abusers.
Yeah, makes
specifically
sense.
Harvey
Makes
Weinstein. And also because the film treats all of it with such grace and empathy, there's not a single scene in this film that isn't full of rigorous empathy. This film has a lot of love and care put into it that I do think comes through in the material, but especially the performances. Zoe Kazan especially is fantastic here. She's really, really good. The standout by far, as far as I'm concerned. So I do understand the criticisms regarding its structure, regarding its formula, but that really didn't bother me. I kind of love that it was straightforward and that it was all about the empathy that these characters are portraying. I'll leave it at that because there's many great female writers out there that have written about this movie, both positively and negatively. There's actually a really great article on Days right now where they talk about how maybe this was a little bit too premature, especially because of Brad Pitt's involvement with all of this. That's
a good point.
Encourage you to check out. Or you can go to Awards Watch, where the great Sophia Simonello has a review up there as well. Yeah. That's very, very good. But there's many other great female critics that we love that have written about this movie. I would just urge you to go and check all of that out. I have a few on my Letterboxd if you want to see a few links there for She Said. And then the last film I want to talk about is Till. And this is, of course, the movie about Emmett Till and what happened to him, specifically his mother in the aftermath of her having to experience not only her grief, but then go through the immediate court proceedings and what follows there, and then eventually her becoming a part of the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s. And similarly to She Said, there's perhaps some conventional filmmaking going on here, but for the same reasons, it's to allow the performances and the weight of this story to be front and center. This isn't one of those movies that needed to be bogged down. I guess it depends on execution. I shouldn't say, like, I'm never going to be against ambition.
No,
whether
no.
it be this film or She Said. If ambition is what drives those movies and it works, then by all means, go for it. But on the same token, I think by being straightforward and allowing the material and the grief that these characters are experiencing and the empathy that is being poured into them, for that to be what's most important, I understand why they do it in that way. And in that same way, Till isn't doing anything flashy from a filmmaking perspective, but the performances here and the grief that they are experiencing is profoundly moving.
Okay.
Danielle Deadwyler gives a truly astonishing performance.
I've been hearing that all day.
She's really, really great. I will say, though, to Chinonye Chukwu's credit, and forgive me, I'm probably butchering that name, but to her credit, what I really love about her filmmaking here is the restraint that she shows. And I don't mean restraint as in she's being straightforward and that's what's effective.
Right.
I mean, she is holding back in an artistic way that allows for the poignancy and the pathos at the center of this film and the conviction of Deadwyler's performance to come through all the more viscerally and all the more palpably. And I say that specifically because I think her performance is maybe most potent when it's more still and when it's more quiet. There's a moment, for example, there's a moment where Emmett's body comes back to Chicago and she's looking at it for the first time. Now, there's an immediate moment of explosion right as the child arrives in Chicago in the casket and she's seeing the casket for the first time. That's understandable. Every parent would have that reaction. But when they go to the morgue and she sees his body for the first time, it's very quiet. It's very still. There's some fascinating composition work there with the camera. And Deadwyler is simply taking in the moment. She's reflecting on her memories with Emmett and just examining the body. And it's very tender. It's gingerly. It's poignant, but it's not explosive. It's not the Oscars explosive emotional moment that's going to be the clip when they announce her at the Oscars. It's not that. It is the opposite of that.
The better kind, if you ask me.
I agree.
I haven't seen the film yet, but that's usually the kind of performance I respond to, at least those specific attributes.
Absolutely. It is so understated, but with a quiet buildup, because, again, she's seeing her dead son for the first time. So it's understated, but as she examines the body and she sees just how messed up he is, there's a slow buildup to the catharsis that comes. And that is truly riveting filmmaking and performance. And to me, that's where this film is at its best. When it's functioning within that style. There's another moment later on in the film, this medium shot of Mammy, the Deadwyler character, simply looking into a window, and we see her reflection off the window. And again, it's the understated nature of it and the simple composition of it that is really great. If the film was that exclusively, we're talking about best film of the year kind of material.
Oh, wow. Really? Interesting.
Like it's that good. Now, of course, it's not that the entire time, because it wants to get into the courtroom drama. It wants to get into the racism of the South and all of that. Again, it's not bad. It's just handled, straightforwardly. And it's what holds the film, I think, back from being like within my top 10, let's say. But I still think on the whole, it's a good movie. It's a hard watch, but it's one worth checking out because of the performance, because of those understated scenes, and just how biting the film is at times. Surprisingly so. I don't know if I expected this film to do what it does from an artistic perspective, especially given its trailer and, because it seems like one of those Oscar-y type of movies, and it is kind of, but not wholly. It surprises you. And
Okay.
I appreciate
I mean, if
that.
if the Fablemans taught us anything, it's not to trust marketing for certain movies that have a dramatic edge. So
Exactly.
it sounds like this is yet another example of that.
Exactly. So I do like Tilt. I really like it a lot. I don't know if it'll end up in my top 10, but Deadweiler will absolutely be talked about at the InSession Film Awards. She's
Heard that
really
name
great.
a lot. Been hearing that name a lot.
Anyway, I think we'll go ahead and cap it at that. We've been going on here a little while, and
Yeah. What was it, JD? 8 films we just talked about in a
Yeah.
span of 2 hours? That's
pretty
not
good.
too bad considering how long-winded we tend to get.
Yeah, that's pretty good. I think we did well. Do you have any final thoughts on anything before we get out of here?
I know we'll talk about this when we get to our award show, so I guess I'll just say this now because we still have a lot of not just movies to catch up with to close out the awards year and just the year in general, but a lot of big movies, a lot of movies that are going to feel like events, right? I mean, we have Avatar: The Way of Water. Babylon's going to feel like an event in its own way.
Yeah.
A lot of talk about movies like The Whale, whether people like that or not. There's a lot of discourse and excitement around them.
Yeah.
So I'll just say this now, JD. 2022, I think, is shaping up to be a really strong year for film. I don't know how
Yeah.
you're feeling about it.
Well, and it's really interesting. I can't remember if we had this conversation on air or not, but I do think up until about, October, it was starting to feel like kind of for me, I was down the middle. Obviously,
Yeah.
some great stuff from the first half of the year, but I don't
Actually, yeah,
know.
and we talked about that during our mid-year report, right?
Yeah.
We thought it was
Yeah.
maybe a little top-heavy at that point, but not necessarily great just yet.
Yes, yes.
And but it got to that point. We thought about that.
Absolutely. And it took a little while because even through August, and August is always a bad month, but
Sure.
September wasn't great either. Parts of October were a little mediocre, but then all of a sudden we got flooded with a bunch of great movies, like all at the same time.
This is going to be the year of the November flood.
Yeah, November, late October and into November, things ramped up to an incredible degree. So yeah, I think when it's all said and done, it's going to end up being a good year for film for sure. But it took a while. It took a while to get there.
But it's
a slow
and it's
burn.
also because I'm looking at my current top 4, maybe top 5 or something like that. Most of these films are sitting in the 4.5-star range on Letterboxd. I'm almost tempted to push these up to a 5 out of 5. I like a lot of these films that much, and I can't say I had that reaction this early for last year or even the year before. So
Yeah.
I think maybe from a overarching standpoint, 2022 won't necessarily be any better or worse than, let's say, last year or the year before, but I think it might end up having more heavy hitters, though.
Yeah, I think that's very true. I think on the whole, last year will end up being deeper, but I agree. I think in terms of heavy hitters, this year will be comparable at the very least to what we got last year. And maybe even 2020 as well. So
Sure, yeah.
yeah, because looking at my top 10, and we haven't seen everything yet.
Right.
Yeah, I'm really liking that 10. Really liking it a lot. So
It's a good. I have a good 10 right now too, and I'm so far behind. It's actually starting to make me nervous.
yeah, and I am excited for what December is going to bring, and because you talked about The Whale, Babylon, we haven't gotten to, Broker, one of my favorite directors,
Hirokazu Koreeda.
So we have to get to that as well. Yeah, just we're not quite done yet. There's still some good stuff to sift through. So
Yep, exactly.
all right. Well, with all of that said, thanks to everyone for tuning in to this bonus content episode. If you're a patron, thank you so much for your support. Again, it really does mean the world to us. If you're a non-patron listening to this after it goes to the public, thanks for tuning in. At the very least, that's really all that matters to us, is that you listen, and we hope that you enjoy this content. And if you want to support us, again, that's patreon.com/InSessionFilm. You can sign up for as low as $1 a month, and you get early access to all of this bonus content. So With that, thank you everybody for listening. We will see you very soon on the InSession Film Podcast.
On Florida's Space Coast, we think you can have the best of both worlds. Kind of like right now. Driving, at your desk, maybe at the gym, but you're also grooving to some music. Visit us and you'll go to the beach and see a rocket launch. Or go kayaking and manatee spotting. It's all waiting for you on the only beach that doubles as a launch pad. Plan your adventure today at visitspacecoast.com.